Amen. Okay, what was the theme of Nehemiah 13? Remember. Nehemiah comes to Jerusalem. He rebuilds the wall. He stays there for a number of years. He gets called back to where he came from, which was where? Where did he come from? He came from Persia. In fact, that'll be next week. Next week, in the Persian period, we'll essentially just kind of look at and discuss 3 different Persian kings, because those are the only 3 Persian kings relevant to the biblical account. But he has to go back to Persia. Then he comes back, and in Nehemiah 13, he finds these problems. He goes to begin to set the problems right, cleansing the temple, restoring the tithes, stopping them breaking the Sabbath, stopping their mixed marriages where they were marrying people who were outside of the children of Israel. That was allowing them to introduce idolatry. God had told them not to do that in Deuteronomy 7. And then cleansing the priesthood at the end of the book of Nehemiah in Nehemiah chapter 13. But a theme for the chapter itself is, especially, it occurs 3 times in the chapter, but right there at the end, Nehemiah 13 verse 31, he says, remember me, what? Oh God, for good. Okay, last week we just brought up the fact of people requesting God's remembrance, Samson and Hezekiah, Solomon the psalmist, and then also Jeremiah. And I just mentioned that the cry, the call for God to remember is sometimes done in periods of distress, in problematic periods. That's most of the time. But it's also done in times of happiness, in times that are bright and that are uplifting in life to remember God. Okay, so God will remember our deeds just like He remembered Noah and Abraham and Hannah. He remembered Rome. We kind of stopped on this. He remembered Rome in the book of Revelation, because in Revelation 16 and also in 18, Rome had been wicked, ungodly. So God was going to remember what they did. That uses figurative speech, because it talks about and it sets it into the framework of God having the mental capacity to remember, which would imply He would have the mental capacity to do what? To forget. But all of this is just the way that language is colored, the way that language is figuratively used. Does God ever forget anything? Well, no. Why? Because He's higher and holier than all of us. Nevertheless, it speaks that even when all of this terrible destruction and ungodliness is going on, it's playing out on the face of the earth, God is in heaven, and He will not what? He will not forget. And so some people, sometimes the punishment of nations doing wrong was immediate. Sometimes it took a while. God would not forget. But a bright spot, Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 10, God will not forget what? He won't forget us. He won't forget, and in the context of Hebrews 6 verse 10, He won't forget these positive things that we do, our labor of love, our labor of faith. He won't forget that. He'll always remember that. And just like He always remembers it. You know, we may do it when we're, we talked about our 2 young guys here this morning. We may do it when we're 20 years old. We may begin when we're 20 years old. God will never what? He won't forget anything that you do, both positive and negative. Positive in His service or negative in turning away from Him. God will not forget. Now, the last thing that we're going to do in this lesson is just put it into the context of Nehemiah chapter 13. We begin Nehemiah chapter 5 and verse 9. This is the only one that jumps out of Nehemiah 13. But Nehemiah chapter 5 verse 19. Remember my sacrifice for your people. What did Nehemiah have to do In rebuilding the walls, what all did Nehemiah, actually, what all did he have to do? The first thing he had to do, think back to chapter 2. What's the first thing he had to do? He had to gather up the courage to ask the king just to come back and do it. So he comes back and does. He's got to go around and discover all the damage. He's got to get the people to want to work. He's got to keep them working. He's got to deal with what? He's got to deal with enemies. He's got to deal with red tape. Remember that when we get to next week and we start talking about kings in the Persian period, because one of them he actually was, Nehemiah had to deal with him. So he has to deal with the red tape. He's got to deal with the discouragement. He's got to deal with people not doing what they should do. He has to deal with the discouragement of them desecrating the temple, of them desecrating the Sabbath, of them desecrating marriage. Nehemiah's got to deal with all of that. Remember me, O God, for my work among your people. We hold up Nehemiah just as a great individual in this Old Testament historical period of time. But he shows this great leadership. I mentioned to you guys weeks and weeks ago. You can look at these aspects of Nehemiah's leadership, which we technically didn't do, but they become kind of this perfect textbook on how to be a leader. And all of this stuff is playing out. And we kind of forget. This was a hard job. A hard job. So remember me, God, because why? I didn't what? I didn't give up. Philippians chapter 2. Who's in Philippians chapter 2? Verses 20 and 21. Who's in Philippians 2, 20 and 21? Who's in Philippians 2, 20 and 21? Who was this? This was Timothy. This was Timothy. So what did Timothy do? What did Timothy do? He wants to send Timothy to them. Why does he want to send them to? Timothy doesn't take the letter. Epaphroditus takes the letter down in verse 25. But why does he want to send Timothy to the Philippians? Right. And as he goes, so that I can be encouraged when I know your state. Why does he send him in verse 20? Number one, he's trustworthy. He agrees with me. There's not going to be a difficulty of us being on different pages. So he agrees with me. And why else in verse 20? He sincerely cares for you. For all seek their own, not the things which are of Christ Jesus. But Timothy is different. So why do we need to be remembered? Or what can we be remembered for? We can be remembered for our sacrifice for the people. Now let's get to Numbers chapter 13. Remember my zeal for your house. What happens in Nehemiah chapter 13 verse 14, by the way? Nehemiah chapter 13 verse 14. What took place there? He had just come to the end of doing what? Right. Of taking out the person who didn't belong in the temple, which was Tobiah, and then restoring the tithes that were given to the priest. So Nehemiah was showing a zeal for the house, just like who did? in John chapter 2, which we didn't go deep enough into John chapter 2 to study it, but who did it in John 2? Jesus did. On what occasion? Drove out the money changers. We will see in the harmony of the Gospels, this happens twice. And I don't know if there's any significance to it happening at the beginning and at the end, but that's when it happened. John chapter 2 is the beginning of his ministry. He comes in during that Passover and he drives out the money changers. So when he did that, the disciples witnessing it and John commenting on it brings up Psalm 69, where zeal for your house has what? Eaten me up. So, the background of zeal, the background of the word for zeal is what? I mentioned this, but it has been a little while. Probably quite a few weeks in the class study. Like a passion or a fire. Or a fire. Can we be on fire for the Lord's house? Not this house, but can we be on fire for the Lord's house? Because that was the zeal that was shown. In Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 22, what was the occasion? Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 22. I commanded the Levites that they should cleanse themselves and that they should go and guard the gates to sanctify the Sabbath day. Remember my zeal for your day. So what do we get to do during the day here? I get to come and I get to worship God. What does worshiping God mean? It means that I get to revere Him. The definition of worship is an homage. We pay homage to God, which just means that we recognize His power and His greatness. We recognize His goodness, and we show gratitude for that. We recognize the position that we have to that. We recognize that God's the creator of all things, and because He is the creator of all things, He does have power over me to direct my life. Now, people can reject that direction. In fact, most people do. But I recognize that He has the power to direct me. If I want to be someone who is His servant, then I've got to follow that direction. And one of the things that I do in following that direction is I come here and I enjoy the day. And hopefully, everyone that comes enjoys the day. And we see the significance of it, not just being around people that we've been around for a long time, and it's not just an experience that we have with people that we like and that have, again, been such a big part of our lives for so many years, but we enjoy it for what it is. That essence of the glorification of God, the essence of the honoring of God. That's for Him. Now, what about my zeal for the day? What can I get out of the zeal for the day? What do I get out of the zeal for the day? What? Yes, I'm uplifted. So in being uplifted, ultimately, what is the end result of being uplifted? I am strengthened. I'm drawn closer to God. And there's a lot of different elements in our worship, and maybe that's one of the reasons God designed a lot of different elements in the worship. Because, I get it. I understand that there are lessons that I do that either because of me, for whatever reason, they fall flat, or for whatever reason, maybe you struggle trying to decipher the relevancy of that specific lesson in your life. I'm not gonna quibble about that. I I think that's legitimate. We understand the Bible's always relevant to our life, but maybe the one part that I picked out on that one day, maybe you struggle a little bit for that relevance. But there's a lot of the other part of that worship, and that lets me uplift myself. That lets me find strength. That's why I draw close to God. Okay, just a couple of more for us to think about. In Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 29, this is when he's cleansing the priesthood. Again, he's got to get Tobiah out of there and other wrongful influences. Remember my zeal for your what? For your purity. So what does God ask us to do? Yes, command. Yes, demand. But ultimately, we can do what? We can just walk away from it. Yes. Does He command? Yes. Does He demand? Yes. But we don't have to do it. We don't have to do it. We can do whatever we want. Technically speaking, can we not? We can do whatever we want. Why have a zeal for purity? So if someone has it in their heart to please the Lord, then unquestionably, you've got to have a zeal for purity. Okay? Why else? What else do I find with that zeal for purity? You've probably told your kids and grandkids this too. If you live a pure life, what's going to happen? Your life's going to be a lot easier. Guys, let me go back to my sermon. Drinking. Again, so much that had to be left unsaid about drinking, but I will say this. I will ask this. Guys, do you have any idea how many people have completely ruined their lives because they took the first drink? Any idea? Some people can take that first one, doesn't faze them. I don't think they're doing the will of God, but it doesn't faze their life in a material way. Sometimes, with some people, it's like a nuclear bomb goes off in their life. If they live a life, and I could substitute in a bunch of different sins, what do you think what do you think a person who just habitually lies, what do you think they're going to be like to work with? Do you think that people are going to keep them in their employment once they find that out? Probably not. I mean, we could pick a bunch of different sins. If someone doesn't respect the purity of God, their life unquestionably is going to be a lot harder. You live by righteousness. You have a zeal for righteousness. Not that you look down on everybody or that you're always the goody-goody one, but you live to principles that elevate you in what you say, in what you wear, in how you act, in the places that you go, in what you choose to participate in. If you choose those elevating, holier, higher principles, your life is going to be a lot easier. Okay, one more. Chapter 13, verse 31, this is the last verse of the chapter. Remember my zeal for your work. For your work. I love 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58. It's all that we'll get to comment on. What does 15:58 say? Yep. Steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. How does the verse finish? Because what you've done will never what? Be in vain. What you've done will never be in vain. It may not be cataclysmic as far as the world stage is concerned. Your labor may only affect a handful of people, but it's not been what? It's not been in vain. It's not been in vain. So a work of encouragement, a work of teaching, a work of exhortation to people, a work of trying to keep people faithful to the Lord. Yeah, again, it may not be monumental in the whole grand scheme of all the way down through history, but it sure can be important, and it sure won't be in vain. Okay, hope that everyone's enjoyed Ezra, Esther, and Nehemiah. We will go on into the intertestamental period next Sunday.